Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.
Alongside me today is Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a privilege and an honor to be with you.
So I guess to get started, I would love to just hear, at the time whenever you were wanting to start your own farm, in a world to where a lot of the farms were more conventional, what made you choose a different route?
Yeah, well, fortunately, I have a genetic streak. If you're looking for pedigrees, my grandfather, my dad's dad, was a charter subscriber to Rodale's Organic Gardening and Farming magazine when it came out in 1945, something like that. And he never farmed full time, but he had a huge organic garden and raised all sorts of things. He had chickens and honeybees and all sorts of stuff. And so Dad got that bent from his dad, and I got it from Dad. So I'm not the one that was converted. I got it through the pipeline, and just the greatest blessing of my life was growing up in a family that actually embraced being a maverick. And I think that's a really wonderful gift to bestow your kids, to actually not be dependent on what everybody else says.
That's awesome, because that kind of reminds me of my brother. He really instilled for me really critical thinking, but also questioning. And I'm sure that that's the questioning everything essentially. And I'm assuming that's the same. That's just the same vibe that your father and grandfather instilled that into yourself.
Yeah, that's right. The orthodoxy, whatever the orthodox narrative is, be willing to question it. And boy, if there's one vocation that that whatever relies on peer dependency, it's farming. It's kind of a lonely vocation. And so when farmers get together, they really depend on each other for encouragement and fellowship. And so I think there's a predisposition to peer dependency and for orthodox fraternity acceptance, almost more in agriculture and farming than in almost any other vocation.
So you mentioned about the lonely vocation, and I had a previous farmer in my podcast, and he actually mentioned one of your Stockton Grass Farmer articles on farmer suicide rates and comparing that to suicide rates for veterans, and that really took me aback. And I would love to just hear your thoughts on why that's such a issue. If Because obviously very secluded in a lot of ways and very stressful environments, especially from a business standpoint. I would just love to hear you expand more on that.
Well, I think there's kind of two elements of this. One is that farmers aren't just working for somebody. They generally, own some land. They've got, and so the farm becomes their identity. And it's not like whatever, being a cubicle IT guy in a in a big global network, where you're just one of thousands in a big Fortune 500 company. Rather, this becomes the farm, become the land, the farmscape, and the whole venture becomes an expression of your own personal identity. And so when that starts to fail, so that's the first part, that I think from a vocational standpoint, it's on a totally different plane than just punching a time clock working for somebody. If I don't like it here, I can go work for somebody else, and nobody thinks. And the most people will say, "Hey, I'm glad you quit that junky place and you got a better place." But in farming, you can't just say, "Well, I'm gonna quit this and go over here." Suddenly, you become a failure. And so that's the one element. The second element, I think, is that farmers more and more are just feeling like they can't control their destiny. There are things that are happening in policy, in geopolitical circles, in the economy, that they just can't control. I mean, my favorite 30-second soundbite when somebody asked me, well, how has farming changed? In 1961, when mom and dad bought this property, it was $90 an acre, and stocker calves were bringing $180, and an acre would grow half of one a year. So half 180 is $90. So the land would produce $90 a year. The market value was $90 a year. So you had a 1-to-1 market to production ratio. Today, that land is $7,000. The stocker is $700. Half of that's $350. So instead of a 1-to-1 ratio, we've got 7,000 to 350, which is a 20-to-1 ratio. And the farmer, what I'm getting at, Ryan, is in this context, the farmer virtually had nothing to do with that. Those were all forces outside the farmer's purview. Economics, unions driving up the cost of the wage thing, regulations that made tractor tires more expensive, cheap food policies that drove down the cost of food and up the cost of manufactured articles. I mean, there's a slew of things there that have affected that, but more and more, I think farmers feel both unheard and disenfranchised from the table, and so that's one reason why I push the things that I do, because I don't want us all to become a bunch of whiners and victims. I want us to figure out, okay, the context has changed, so how do we adapt to it, and how do we, how do we, whatever, make the changes that are necessary in this new context. So I think the identity element, and then the kind of, I don't control this element. I can't even move to another job. Those two things, kind of collude in the heart and mind and the soul of a farmer, that when things are not good, it amplifies a not good situation.
So what you said too with the unheard, and that's exactly why I have this brand. My whole life I was disconnected from agriculture. I had never visited a farm, never talked to a farmer until I'd say 27 or 28. And I know a lot of folks could go their whole lives without ever experiencing that. And a lot of things too that I've read, that especially on the sheer number of farms, for the context of dairy farms, I remember reading in 1970 there was I think 480,000 dairy farms, and now there's 28,000 or less.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
With the rising of inflation and just the outrageous government spending that's completely out of control, and then the average age of the farmer continuing to increase,
Right.
and a lot of them don't have an heir.
Mm-hmm.
I guess outside of, I'm trying to formulate the best question for that. How could we incentivize, or I guess try to get new folks into the space, and potentially not necessarily starting a huge farm, but it could just be a micro dairy, or yeah, I guess how could we just get more folks into this space and more interested in agriculture and food production?
Yeah. So yeah, it's, let me, this might not be the best answer or even the right answer, but I'll take a little bit of a stab at it. If I'm sure you're familiar with permaculture, and one of the principles of permaculture is stacking, and of course one of the principles of good business is value adding. And so what has, so I alluded to some negatives a little bit ago, but the positives are that as the industry has become worse and worse, the awareness on the consumer end of the, nutrient deficiency, pathogenicity, toxicity, environmental degradation, I mean, all these species annihilation, whatever, all of those elements on the consumer end, that awareness is increasing by the day. in my view, one of the responses to this very different, climate is number one, if a farmer wants to, change his stars, if you will, okay, then number one, um, view your friends as your patrons. We call our customers our patron saints. So our best friends are not farmers. We love farmers, but they're not our best. Our best friends is our patron base. That has become our new fraternity. We call them our cheerleaders. All right. And believe it or not, there are thousands of people out there who, if you have a really good product and you smile and you're happy to see people and you give them hugs and you give them information and encourage them and make them feel like they are participating in something sacred and righteous and honoring and healing and redemptive, man, they will jump off a cliff for you. And so cultivating that relationship, it goes a long way in reducing the loneliness that I talked about. It won't be solved by other farmers. It'll be solved by a new community that is ready to, go to the mat to protect you, to help you, and make you successful. Then the second part of that then is the economic part, is that when you start wearing the middleman hats, and of course, middlemen have been demonized by farmers all my life. All my life I've heard farmers sit on the lean up against the the side of their pickup truck and badmouth those middlemen. Those middlemen, they make all the money. They make all the money. There's no money left for us. And the truth is that processing, marketing, and distribution are expensive. They do take a lot of expense. And so if we take that retail dollar and we divide it four ways: production, processing, marketing, and distribution, the more of those three, the marketing, distribution, and processing, that the farmer can own, think about it, taking the raw product farther toward the plate, if you will, the more the farmer can own, that is a way to get off of the treadmill of having to outproduce at low margins at commodity prices and try to beat it on production alone. Now you're starting to beat the economic situation, with other aspects of the food chain. And so I think that if we can rebuild a different cheerleader patron base, and if we can retake the value-added components of the food and fiber system, instead of selling logs, sell boards. Instead of selling cows, sell T-bone steaks, or even get a food truck and and sell burgers. All right. The more that you can move into that sphere, the more you will adapt to this change of context that I've described.
On the topic of economics, because that's a huge part of, it's a business overall, but especially with agriculture, and from the consumer standpoint, they're not highly aware of everything that goes into the piece of chicken that they're buying, or a piece of fruit, for example. I would just love to dive into more of the economics of farming, especially for small producers, because like I was mentioning too, with the dairy, the dairies are just getting smaller and smaller. And then just a side note, I was reading in Oregon how they're trying to say one dairy cow is now equal to a CAFO. And I know there's a couple dairy farmers that are pushing back to that. Sorry, that blew my mind when I read that it's just another example of the government. But if we could just talk to, just for the small producers, just the economics, especially for interested people that Say they might be living in a major city and they might want to not necessarily buy land, they could rent land and start their own venture. Would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, the single biggest impediment to starting in a production in a farm production business, of course, is the price of land. And I'm a big fan. I appreciate you mentioning you don't have to have land. What you have to do is manage land. To be a farmer, you don't have to own land. You just have to be able to manage land. So one of the benefits of portability and mobility in production is that you can collaborate on an existing land base without having to buy it. For example, anybody that knows us, does any research on me, knows about our pastured poultry operation. All right. So we have these portable field shelters that we move along. They're very small, 10 by 12 feet. You move them by hand, and you can put 75 birds in each one. And in the 60 seconds, you move them along the pasture. And the beauty of this is there is not an acre of farmland in the world that wouldn't benefit from chickens running across it. I don't care whether it's an orchard, a wheat farm, a beef cattle farm, a dairy, or whatever. And so if you can stack a farm enterprise and build it with infrastructure that's mobile and without the capital cost of the land, you've suddenly got a much more nimble business than you have, if it's all stationary and capital intensive. And so I'm quick to say that with the mobile infrastructure, it frees us from having to own the land. With modular infrastructure, we scale by duplication, not by centralization. So you can scale with cash flow without debt. You can scale up as you go, instead of having to put all your capital in one great big, for example, a great big Tyson chicken house just to start one. For us, all we got to do is cancel our Netflix subscription for 3 months, and you can build one of these, and you're in the chicken business. If you like it, you can build a second one. If you like it more, you can build another one. If you're as crazy as we are, you can build over 200 of them. But it's over years, scaled by duplication, not by centralization, and then it's management intensive. So we don't apologize that would this take more farmers? Yes, it certainly would, but it would take far fewer pharmaceuticals, far fewer attorneys, far fewer bankers, far less fertilizer, whatever. A lot of things would change, and I think that's a good thing. And so our equity, instead of being in depreciable stationary assets and high inputs, our equity becomes management, information, and a patron base. And no banker can ever foreclose on your skill or put a lien on what you know, on your knowledge. And so that fundamentally changes the economics of the farm enterprise when you move that direction, as opposed to grain elevators, $1 million combines, great big tractors, and centralization with mechanization and depreciation, and trying to eliminate the people component of it. So this makes a people-centric type of agriculture, but I don't think it's a bad thing to have a people-centric agriculture.
So I have two questions, one on chickens and then the second on the land part. So for the chickens specifically, when I worked on a farm, the primary feed for the chickens were corn and soy, and I know that's very common. For the folks that want to avoid that, and just again on the economics of chicken feed, what are some things that they should look for to potentially feed their chickens outside of the pastures that they're on?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a lot of alternatives, but on our farm we use GMO-free corn and soybeans and oats in our ration, as well as some organic mineral and vitamin supplements from Fur Trail, and so yeah, there, I mean, yeah, you can use fish and the chicken will taste kind of fishy sometimes. And that patronizes Japanese drift nets, which are destroying the oceans. So yeah, you can use fish instead, destroy the ocean fisheries. That's okay. You can use cowpeas, and that'll be twice as expensive, which jacks your chicken price up. And now now it's very very hard to sell. Uh, I mean, there are things you can do. I mean, you can use earthworms, but there are things you can do on a small scale that are very difficult to do on a larger scale. I mean, for us, if we substituted our uh, and the whole corn soybean thing, so we use whole roasted soybeans. That's very different than soybean meal. Soybean meal, they press out all the seven oils or all the oils, and all the enzymes are gone, and all the balancing effect of the stuff is gone. I think you look, corn is an amazing plant. I mean, maize, built the Americas. I mean, if there's one native thing here, it's corn. Um, what's happened is that through all sorts of manipulation and even some innuendo, um, we want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so look, let's take soybean meal. We all know that when we break up food, it changes. So, for example, since it'd be like saying, well, since high fructose corn syrup comes from corn, I'm never going to eat corn on the cob. No, it's completely different when you eat the whole food, the whole unprocessed food. And so we use whole unprocessed, and that changed it. The American Pastured Poultry Producers Association did a 2-year study several years ago on estrogens. That's the big red light in soy, and found that the highest estrogen in the chickens was chickens that got clover. Well, chickens love clover. Are you going to tell a chicken you can't eat clover? No, chickens love clover. And so sometimes I think we've almost become too smart for our own good, and we start to compartmentalize, break up, and segregate even supposedly good things nutritionally, and don't just take a balanced look at this. And I have a hard time demonizing whole foods. I just think whole foods are okay, and we're good to go.
And then on the topic of leasing land, I read the book Meat Racket, and it was on Tyson's history and how they would just essentially take advantage of the farmers that were leasing land for the chickens, like Jerry Yandel. Just a horrific story for folks that are looking to switch then and start their own small scale farm and wanting to rent some land. How can they ensure, or what questions should they be asking to ensure that they're not being taken advantage, since they might be coming from a naive perspective, since they're not so used to being in the agriculture space their whole lives?
You mean somebody who's getting ready to lease some land to not be taken advantage of by a landlord?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, well, these things are relationship oriented, and what you want is a landlord that shares your values. And I mean, for example, if you're not wanting to use chemicals and the landlord wants you to spray every thistle that comes up, that's not a good landlord for you. And so I guess the main protection here in not getting into a bad situation is to really be clear about your expectations. We lease about 15 properties in the area, and we actually have in the lease, we have about an 8-point bullet point thing of things that the land is going to look like. I mean, we do this controlled grazing, and so sometimes we remove all the animals and let things blow out, to make seed and diversity and pollinators and field mice and all sorts of things. And and it and neighbors look at it and say it looks like trash. Okay, but we're going to go in there with a mob of cows and we're going to graze about half of it. They're going to stomp the rest of it on the ground and mulch it down. And that's going to be our new, carbon fertilizer for the next year. And so we actually are very clear with landlords when we go. There will be times when it looks like a weed patch, and there will be times when it looks like a golf course. And so, it's going to fluctuate throughout. And so I think as long as you're real clear, with what the expectation, people will rise to almost any expectation if it's precisely and clearly articulated. The thing that kills relationships is unspoken expectations. Oh, I just figured you knew I'd, whatever. And I mean, it destroys marriages, it destroys, business partnerships, and it destroys all these kinds of things. So be clear about your expectation, and don't, under promise and over deliver. And, if you're gonna, like we tell our landlords, we're not going to surprise you when we're going to bring cows over. We're going to give you a couple days notice, tell you when they're coming, and when we're going to take them out, that sort of thing. And you communicate. Nobody likes surprises, and those are all ways to kind of keep everybody on the same page.
On the topic of cows, with especially in current events recently, would love to hear your thoughts on the EID tags.
You mean the radio control, the
electronic tags?
Yeah, electronic tags. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't have a problem with them, whatever, inherently. I think it'd be fun to, be able to keep up with your cows, if you want to. I don't have a problem with it. What I have a problem with is when the government begins mandating, and you can't get an animal slaughtered unless it has an RFID tag in it, or you can't put a cow on a trailer and move it from one property to another unless it has an RFID tag in it. And especially if there's a database that all the information goes into. And so, the RFID is one stage away from, broadcasting bovine information out, where, we now they're working with artificial intelligence to swallow a broadcasting bolus that can measure the pH and the chews and the manure and everything going, body temperature of the cow, go into a database. That's fine if it goes into your database. The problem is that it's going into, the World Economic Forum's database. And that's my problem with precision agriculture. Precision agriculture is bandied about like it's some sort of a, wonderful be all end all. But and again, I'm not, I don't mind camera monitoring, using drones to, check fences. I mean, that's all great. The problem is either a mandated participation into a database, or I would say even a voluntary participation into a centralized database that is monitored and manipulated and managed by a centralized whatever, brain. And I call, do we really want Ag Alexa? Because Ag Alexa is never going to tell you, you might have avian influenza in your chickens. Have you ever thought about putting them out on pasture so they get fresh exercise and sunshine and green grass and are build up their immune system? It's never going to say that. It's never going to say, you've got a little bit of soil imbalance there in field number 3. We recommend you putting compost on it. And so I call this, if we have an Ag Alexa, it's going to be basically like, putting Dr. Fauci in charge of your farm. And I'm not sure too many people want that. And so I'm certainly not against technology. I love the technology, but the technology has to be owned by you. It has to be voluntary, not mandatory. And the data needs to be a database or platform that can't be manipulated by powers outside your farm.
I guess, how do we, with that being said, and especially with the powers outside the farm, is just another thing that we just need to educate and raise awareness as much as possible to push back to the fact that, because I'm there with you in the sense that I love these technologies, but my issue is always whenever it's government mandated.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, is it just something that we just need to continue to educate the masses on, or how to push back to that so it does not make it to where it's forced on you?
Well, yeah, and if you don't want to participate, to be able to have an opt out strategy. And yeah, I think we do have to push back on that. We have to not comply and let people know. I mean, I like my little sound bite. Do you really want Dr. Fauci in charge of our farms? I think that's a powerful sound bite that would resonate with a lot of people today. And so we need to think about clever ways to explain to people that that government decision making on my farm is going to be one more step from government decision making on our food. I mean, look, the government decision making on our food has a terrible track record. I mean, the government told us to get rid of lard and butter and use margarine and hydrogenated vegetable oil. The government gave us a food pyramid that put Cheerios and Cocoa Puffs on the foundational bottom of it. The government told, I mean, you can go down the line. The government's track record on whether it's, nutrition or food or whatever, the government track record is abysmal. I mean, the government, the government, how many years did they take people like me to free steak dinners to encourage us to feed dead cows to cows? And then we had bovine spongiform encephalopathy, mad cow. Listen, the government's track record is terrible. And so it's been bad enough in food. Well, we don't need to now put that in charge of our farms as well. And so, those are the kinds of things, the kind of messages, I think, that you can say very succinctly and very, with a smile to people, and just help them to understand that that government, and certainly here, at this point in time, after what we've just been through since 2020, never has our country, I mean, this is now axiomatic. There has never been more mistrust of iconic institutions, including the government. So don't think that if you dare to say, do you really want the government in charge of our farm or making decisions for me on my farm at the federal government level? Just ask the question and stop. I'm convinced the average person would say, well, no, you're the one that's there. You see what's going on. You take the best information and make your decision. I don't want some bureaucrat in DC making a decision for your farm. That's how you have to message it. So folks, make the connection.
It wasn't surprised, but at the same time, I still couldn't believe it. When reading the USDA dietary guidelines from 2020 to 2025, they had an infographic showing nutrient dense vegetable oil, and then it was below that was, I forgot the actual word, it might have just been less nutrient dense, and it's a picture of butter. And it's just that those are the very institutions that we're quote unquote supposed to trust, and it's telling us to not consume something that we've done for thousands and thousands of years.
Right.
I think that's a good segue too in the topic of raw milk. So the hat I'm wearing is Make Milk Raw Again, because that's another thing to where I thought it will make us sick and die, should be illegal for 27 years, and realized how long I've been misled on that. And it makes me think about, I remember hearing an excerpt you've mentioned about drinking the cow water and getting dirty and with the microbes and bacteria. And I think that's a crucial part of raw milk.
Yes.
So I'd just love to talk about that, because that's, again, something that's It's interesting because people will still learn about it, and then there's always that hesitation, even when you first drink it, because it's just been hardwired in our brain that it's going to make you sick. So I'd love to, yeah, just hear your thoughts on raw milk, and then also just the germs and bacteria with all of that.
Yeah, you know, we have an immune system, and that immune system, I liken it to a muscle. And if you don't use it, you lose it. You know, it needs to be exercised. And in the whole world right now, Finland leads the world in really hard research on immunological function, comparing farm raised kids to urban kids. And they've done this over and over. Um, where, you know, kids that raised on a farm, they put some dirt in their mouth, they get some manure in their mouth, whatever, you know, they're in a much unsanitary condition. And their sickness rate is so much lower than the sickness rate in the city that Finland has actually brainstormed ideas. I don't think they've solved it yet, but their ideas, it is such a significant difference. We need to figure out how to get manure and farm soil, barn environments into the city, or get city kids into barn environments so that we exercise their immune system. And a lot of people aren't aware of the hygiene hypothesis. A lot of people read Friedman's Guns, Germs, and Steel, in which he talks about, you know, the civilizations that took over others were the ones that were exposed to germs. And of course, we know that the Native American population was decimated by, you know, European, you know, measles and smallpox and things at the, you know, in around 1492. That's why, you know, the book 1492 explains this. And so in general, if the hygiene hypothesis says, and it's consistent with Guns, Germs, and Steel, that if you don't have periodic assaults on the immune system, it becomes atrophy. It atrophies, and then when there's a real assault on it, you know, some pollen, you know, whatever, then it goes into overdrive, and doesn't know how to handle it. It just goes nuts. And so routine assaults are good. And so, you know, I don't use antimicrobial soap. I actually, you know, routinely eat with unwashed hands. I drink out of the cow trough with the cows. I don't know whether you can see my arm here with a bunch of blood on it. I've just been out this morning with the chainsaw, clearing a fence line and a bunch of brambles and thorn bushes and stuff, and all those splinters and all those little rips and tears are all immuno encouraging. And so in general, what I'm getting at is that the living biological component that we eat, that we surround ourselves with, is part and parcel of our entire, you know, microbiome. And we have sterilized our environment. We've sterilized our food. You know, we're routinely eating things that won't compost, that won't. I mean, you can squeeze Velveeta cheese on the table, and it'll sit there for a year and not change. But if you put real cheese, you know, living cheese on your kitchen table, in 2 days it'll get fuzzy, and in about a week it'll sprout legs and walk off the table. You know, the point is that food that won't decompose won't digest, and so we are routinely eating sterilized, undigestible, uncompostable stuff. One of the funnest illustrations of this I ever saw was I was out doing a presentation for some middle schools out in California, and they had a program. They had a 5-acre farm. These two ladies were running this 5-acre farm for the entire county middle school program, and it was incorporated into the science curriculum. And every week the kids came and spent a couple of hours, you know, at this farm doing something. And so they had this big, like 3 foot by 8 foot earthworm box a bunch of red wiggler earthworms. And so the two farmers, they said, okay, you got a homework assignment, kids. Next Monday when you come, bring some food. And so the next Monday, the kids came, and they came with their, Lunchables and Twizzlers and gummy bears and whatever. And the two farm ladies, they put in an orange and a pound of ground beef and a green bean. Okay. And the next week the kids all came, and they go charging up the hill. They open the lid of the worm box. They look in, and there's the Twizzlers and the hot pockets and whatever. It's all sitting there, and there's no orange. There's no meat. There's no green bean. There's no. Well, what happened? And the obvious object lesson was, well, why would you want to eat something worms won't even eat? And it was a profound and powerful word picture for these young people to understand the difference between living food and dead food. And that is all tied up as part of our immune system.
I love that example because now I think our food system is nearly 75% ultra processed food.
Yes.
But then also going back to this huge disconnection, there's so much toxicity in this world that's caused health issues, but I genuinely believe a huge critical component is our connection to our food, and the fact that that example is just so awesome because we're so used to just food being able to be shelf stable forever. It does not get moldy, and then whenever it does, with I lost my train of thought there, but I'm just saying, yeah, it's just fascinating because for me, that's what I've realized and why I'm trying to educate as much as possible. Because once you visit a farm or just even going to farmers market and having conversations with a farmer and rancher, and then you try the food and you realize that food is just so different than anything you have in stores, on top of stuff that you go
Right.
out to eat on, because a lot of that is just also fake food.
Yeah.
It gets the wheels spinning in your head, and then you start thinking about everything else.
Well,
And
when you think about it, Ryan, look, when you think about it, Ryan, for how many decades now in our country, let's take tomatoes. I mean, there is nothing better. If you've never had a garden grown tomato, there is nothing that compares to juiciness and taste and vitality. But for decades, the industry, what's down at Walmart and Costco and Kroger's, what's down there has not been chosen for taste and nutrition and texture, vitality. It's been chosen for shelf stability and transportability. So all the cultivars that are in the supermarket have been chosen over now decades for shippability. Can it jostle around, in the back of a tractor trailer for 3,000 miles between California and Boston? And when that becomes the criteria, the genetic criteria for cultivar selection, you are not going to have a nutritionally dense, stable, tasty tomato. And so, when you wonder why don't kids like vegetables? Well, it's because our vegetables, they've lost all their taste because the only thing they've been selected for is shippability. And so that's part and parcel of this entire whatever issue that we're dealing with, from sterility to what I call the cardboardization. We're turning all our vegetables into cardboard because cardboard is shippable. And when you do that, not only does it not have the life punch in it, but doesn't even taste good.
I'm glad you mentioned tomatoes specifically, because again, whenever I worked on the farm, they had so many more tomatoes than I could ever think possible on a farm. But just
Yeah.
seeing just different shapes and sizes and colors, but it all tasted
Mm-hmm.
incredible. And then you go in the grocery store, it's the same looking red tomato everywhere. And I remember having conversations at the farmers market because they'd be asking questions about our tomatoes, versus one that was conventionally raised, and they use it for exactly that. And it's just really interesting because then I also saw, it was literally yesterday, someone made a post about Whole Foods. I'm looking at the picture now to where it's a wax and produce to where they use different types of synthetic wraps and waxes to preserve the
Right.
food.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows the list of foods, and it's so many different oranges and apples and eggplants and grapefruits and peppers. And that is just mind-boggling to me, because now even it's just the produce is turning into frankenfoods.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And so like a guy, I did a radio program in January it was a radio program in Vermont, and the guy was saying, and we were talking about local sourcing, local foods. He says, but I'm having guests over for dinner tonight, and I want corn on the cob. And how am I going to get local corn on the cob? I said, why do you need corn on the cob in Vermont in January? You could have bought a bunch of corn on the cob and frozen it, or canned it, or parched it, or dehydrated it during the season last year, and that's the corn you eat in the winter. That's what people have always done. Goodness, that's what Native Americans did. They weren't trying to grow corn on the cob in Vermont, and no, they had it hanging up in the top of their their smoky houses, in the winter, and that's what they would that's what they would eat, and that's what people have done for ages. And so the whole idea of convenience, I want it now. I don't want to think about seasons. I don't want to actually live like I'm dependent on an ecological umbilical. I want to levitate into some Star Trek nirvana, where I can be independent from this from this womb that I'm captivated by. It's a it's a dangerous place. We are far more, our microbiome and our physiology is far closer to our ancestors of long ago than it is to something you see on sci-fi television.
That's what it goes for me. It goes back to the disconnection too, because like you were saying with the fast and expecting to go in the grocery store, everything's stocked, everything that we need, whether it's in season or out of season. We don't think about those things though. The folks that are so disconnected and don't. I guess that's again why I try to push to have these conversations with the actual people that are making this food for everybody, because it's kind of becoming out of sight, out of mind, to like you're saying with the canning and food preservation for long term. These are critical skills that most just aren't aware of or practice ever. And so, yeah, that's just.
Well, Ryan, you can't have, how do you ensure, good question. How do you encourage, incentivize, or ensure an authentic integrity food system? Will you do it by participating in it, by involving in it? And in America, we, for the first time in human history, we have the luxury, and it truly is a luxury. No people have ever been to so profoundly abdicate their domestic culinary and participatory time and skills in food production and preparation and preservation and processing. We are not too long ago, all of our ancestors, good grief, had to start a wood fire in a wood stove and go fetch water in a bucket from a spring, in order to cook. And today we have the most techno glitzy modernized kitchens in the world, but we're the most profoundly disconnected from all that gadgetry. We don't even know how to use it. And so when I say the number one thing you can do to actually protect our food supply is get unprocessed stuff and fix it in your kitchen. And people say, oh, no, I don't have time. No, look, we've got time baked, we've got hot and cold water, we got a refrigerator, we got Instapots, Cuisinarts, ice cream makers, bread makers. I mean, great grandma would give her eye teeth for the kind of stuff and you can do all that while the washing machine's washing your clothes. You don't even have to push them on a washboard. So we have never had it so easy to be able to participate, but been so negligent to not participate. And participation is the key to authenticity in any endeavor. When people fail to participate, when people fail to participate in the schools, guess what they start teaching? When people quit participating in the medical system, guess what they start telling you to do for your health? When people quit participating in anything, the system begins to cheat and centralized into oligarchical, nefarious agendas when people quit participating in systems.
I vividly remember having the very first farm fresh meal with beef that they had on their farm, produce that they grew in their garden, and every time I talk about it or think about it, my mouth just salivates because it was just a literally life-changing meal. Because again, the first 27 years, I just had beef and produce from the store, and that was it.
Yeah.
And since then, yeah, it's just life-changing, and I could not be more grateful for that because now, with that awareness, I'm way more conscious of that food. I go to the farmers markets or farms if I can, and I try to help others have that same realization too, because stuff like ice cream you mentioned with good actual dairy is actually good for you and it tastes incredible.
Yeah.
And with pizza, all kinds of things that are now with the modern Franken foods are horrific and it make you feel like crap. But if you use actual farm fresh ingredients and foods, not only will it taste great, but you won't feel like absolute garbage afterwards.
Yeah.
That's what I find so fascinating is that's become so normalized. Just feeling like crap and having to take an hour-long slumber on your couch, that should not be a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We're on the same wavelength there. And so, you have to think intentionally. And our responsiveness and intentionality in food is what ultimately determines our microbiome and a lot of what we're how we feel. And if you feel like crud, maybe your gasoline's a little, if your engine's not running very good, maybe you've been putting some gunky gas in your fuel tank.
It's very true, especially in America. I have one last topic. So on the topic of God and religion, especially in the culture and climate of America, for me, I was not really religious my whole adult life, and it wasn't actually until I started making the change into agriculture and worked on a farm and just saw all of the connections with how everything really was connected from below the surface to above ground, even just things like trees communicating with one another and sending resources to sick trees. That just, the more I'd start learning just about everything in nature, essentially, and how nature responds. I mean, you take example, just heavy tillage and all the chemicals and destroying that land, nature responds. Or you could go the way that you do it and so many other farmers do it, and nature responds in a different way, in a better, right way. And that just made it for me clear cut that there definitely is a God. And I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that topic. Because I've noticed this too, with a lot of farmers that they're usually religious, and I find that really interesting. And yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, so if my little handle, my moniker is I'm a Christian, libertarian, environmentalist, capitalist, lunatic farmer. And so the first part of that is Christian. Yes, I am a Christian, a believer. And so what that means is ultimately I don't own any of this. I mean, yeah, we've got a deed down at the courthouse that says we own it, but ultimately God owns it. The Bible says He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament is shows His handiwork. It's all His stuff. And so if it's all His stuff, then my responsibility as a steward of His stuff is to run through my pilgrimage and return it, give Him a return on investment. What I'm saying is, if I were God and this world were mine, I would not be really happy when people create deserts and a dead zone the size of Rhode Island in the Gulf of Mexico, and infertile frogs, and three-legged salamanders, and eagle eggs that won't hatch. And, I could go on and on and on, but, that's not a good return on investment. That's what I would call, if this world were and I was a fourth grader with a backpack, it would be equivalent to somebody ripping my backpack off and taking the contents and strewing it out. That would not make me very happy as the owner of the stuff in that backpack. And so for sure, this stewardship for the divine does absolutely impact our thought structure. So I've given you that point. The final, the other aspect of that for me is, when people say, well, what gets you up in the morning? What gets me up is the unbelievable honor and privilege of being able to step out that back porch every day and massage, caress, participate in creation in a very visceral, tangible way. And so my ultimate goal here at Polyface is realizing, yep, it's ultimately not mine, but it's ultimately an object lesson. Creation is a physical object lesson of spiritual truth. So I want people to come and visit, and then when they leave, they say, oh, that's what forgiveness looks like. Oh, that's what redemption looks like. Oh, that's what provision looks like. All these wonderful spiritual truths that we, read about in focus groups in church suddenly become viscerally apparent and visible as we steward this creation. And that, I think, honors God, and it motivates me to continue every day trying to do better, learning, observing, and listening for better stewardship.
I love that. Thank you. And thank you for joining this podcast. Yeah, that's really all I have. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
The last thing I wanted to say, Joel, because this will be offline. So this is very meaningful having this conversation. Me personally, the whole reason why I started this brand, essentially in my last previous 3.5 years were hell on earth. Because this is why I also have the brand is the only reason why I changed is because life just slapped me in the face. My brother had stage 3 cancer at the start of the pandemic that progressed to stage 4. And so in 2021, I went back home to be his caretaker for 6 months as I watched cancer, opioids, and chemo essentially torture him alive and take his life 3 days before his 33rd birthday. On top of that, I was taking care of my mother, who was forced to retire in 2019 because of her health. She had shingles, gout, sleep apnea, coronary artery disease, so the most common heart disease. Her kidney and liver were failing, but she was deemed inoperable because of her heart. She had 12 liters of fluid drained from her lungs in total. And so after my brother died, I quit my job because I come from a tech background. And obviously things still kept getting worse. I had my own health issues to where healthcare failed me. I spent thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to where the only reason why I was able to overcome that is I went independent and found help from the same people that also were failed from the medical system. I launched this brand on May 28th of last year at noon Central. My mother passed away 4 hours later. And so I've been personally, obviously, very affected by everything that we're told to do from the eating standpoint and whatnot. So this is why it's so meaningful because I know you attribute to your father and grandfather, but you've also just stuck to your guns through all of this. And I just respect the hell out of that because, yeah, it's just thank you again for this conversation because I think about the families that have learned about their food and changed their lives through things that you've done. And I think about how they will most likely avoid what I've gone through. And there's nothing more commendable for me than that. Because yeah, I don't wish what I've gone through on my worst enemy. So thank you.
Wow. Oh, thank you. Bless you. That's a powerful, profound, yeah, suffering is no fun but it makes us who we are, and it makes us aware of things. It makes us aware of things we'd never be aware of otherwise. And all of us have our own, whatever, sufferings, have our own things to deal with. But boy, that's a lot for your young life. And bless you for taking that and creating this positive thing out of it. That's a good thing. And if you help a few people avoid the kind of whatever the kind of degeneration you saw in your brother and your mother, that's better than money.
Absolutely. And
Wonderful
I'm
thing.
actually going to be at your event next May or next month in May. So I'm really looking forward to shaking your hand, and thank
Good.
you again.
Good. Thank you, Ryan. Thank
Have
you.
a-
Take care. Have a great day.
You too.
Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.